The last ember in that pile died sometime after 9 o'clock. I know because the moon had cleared the ridge, and the snow was bright enough to read by, and I was still standing there. I had not planned to stay. The contract said monitor until extinguished, secure the perimeter, and drive back down the 7 miles of logging road to where I was camped. That was the job. But I stood there anyway, long after the smoke had thinned to nothing, long after Dex had curled himself into a tight circle against my left boot, and I stood there because something else was standing there too. Across the perimeter, at the exact edge where the spruce trees began, something enormous and still was watching that pile go dark. It did not move when the last glow left the coals. It did not move when I finally exhaled. It only turned slowly, when there was nothing left to watch, and then it was gone into the trees, like a shadow stepping back into the wall it came from. To understand what that meant to me, I need to go back 14 months, to a ridgeline in late August, and to 2 men whose names I will not put in this story, because their families have heard enough. I was a Forest Service crew boss for 19 years. I want to be clear about what that means and what it does not mean. It does not mean I was a scientist or a policy man. It means I was the person who kept 11 other people organized, hydrated, and moving in the right direction across difficult ground while fire did what fire decides to do. My district was in the north-central part of a national forest that I will leave unnamed for the same reason I am leaving the names out. Big timber country, steep drainages. The kind of terrain that looks manageable on a map and feels like a different planet on foot. The Keller Ridge assignment started the way most of them started in late summer. Hot and dry and behind schedule, the fire moving faster than the weather desk had predicted. We were cutting line on the northeast slope when the wind shifted. I have gone over my decisions on that afternoon more times than I can count, the way you go over the arithmetic on a bill you cannot afford, looking for the number that was wrong, the place where a different choice would have changed the sum. The official review found no negligence. The official review found conditions that exceeded the reasonable parameters of crew deployment. I filed that finding in a drawer in my mind where I keep the things I know are technically true and cannot make myself believe. 2 of my crew did not come down off that ridge. They were both young. One of them had a daughter who was 4 months old when he died. And I have thought about that girl every single day since August of the year before last. I drove home from the district office on the day I signed my retirement papers, and I sat in the kitchen of the house I had lived in for 22 years, and the house felt like it belonged to someone else. Marta had been gone for 6 years by then, a stroke that came without any warning on a Tuesday in March, and the house had felt large since her passing, but it had at least felt like mine. After Keller Ridge, it felt borrowed, like I was staying somewhere temporary while I figured out where to go. Cal had not spoken to me in any real way for 3 years, not since a Christmas visit that ended badly and quietly, the kind of ending that happens when 2 people have run out of the energy required to fight and settle for distance instead. He lived 4 states away. He had a wife I had met twice and a boy I had met once, at a rest stop off the interstate, briefly, under circumstances that do not reflect well on me or on Cal, or on the specific failure of communication that had been accumulating between us since he was 17. I had his phone number in my cell. I had dialed the first 4 digits twice in 14 months and stopped both times. Dex was my one reliable daily fact. He was 9 years old, which is old for a blue tick, and he moved like a dog who had earned his slowness, with a kind of deliberate placement of each foot that I recognized because I was moving the same way. He slept at the foot of my bed. He ate his food without complaint. On mornings when I did not get up at a reasonable hour, He would come stand beside the bed and breathe on my hand until I did. He was not dramatic about it. He just breathed, steady and warm, until I moved. Whitaker called on a Thursday in late September. He had been my district ranger for the last 11 of my 19 years and had retired 2 years before I did. And when I heard his voice on the phone, I felt a familiar small pull, like a cable tightening somewhere behind my sternum. "I've got a slash pile contract," he said, "and nobody to run it. 5 days, solo monitor. We did a cut and pile along the Crooked Fork Road back in July, and we need to burn before the snow gets deep. There's already 4 inches up there." I said I appreciated it. "It's not charity," he said. "I know," I said. There was a pause on his end that told me he knew. I did not entirely know. "The pile's already staged," he said. "You'd be igniting, monitoring, and certifying extinguishment. Solo Monitor is in compliance for this pile size. You'd be up that logging road 7 miles and down again for 5 evenings. Not glamorous." "When do you need an answer?" "Tomorrow would be fine." I said I would call him in the morning, and I did, at 7:15, and I said yes. I want to be honest about why I said yes, because the money was not the only reason, though the money was real. I had been in the house for 14 months doing the maintenance a house requires, splitting wood and cleaning gutters and repointing the mortar around the chimney base. And somewhere in that 14 months, the maintenance had stopped feeling like purpose and started feeling like the thing you do while waiting to figure out what your purpose is. Whitaker's call was an offer to go back into the trees and be useful in a way I understood. I told myself it was the contract. What it was, honestly, was that I needed somewhere to put my hands. I loaded Dex into the truck on a Monday morning in early October and drove the 2-lane highway north through a landscape that was past its peak colour, the aspens stripped down to their white bones and the scrub oaks still holding a dark reddish brown that always reminded me of dried blood, which I know is not a cheerful thought. The logging road began at a chain-link gate that I had the combination for, and the road itself was 2 packed ruts with a grass centre strip, climbing steadily through second-growth spruce and lodgepole, the snow line beginning about 2 miles up and deepening as I climbed. By the time I reached the burn site at roughly 6,000 feet, there were 4 inches of snow on the ground, just as Whitaker had described, and the slash pile rose out of it like a small collapsed building, maybe 40 feet across and 12 feet high at the centre, dried limbs and tops from the summer timber sale stacked and settled into each other. I walked the perimeter with Dex while I drank my first coffee of the morning, which I had poured into a steel thermos in the dark of the kitchen at 5 that morning. The perimeter was clear. The pile was dry inside despite the snow, the way slash piles are when they have been staged properly. I marked my extinguishment line with flags, on short stakes I had brought in a bundle, placing them every 20 feet in a rough oval around the pile's edge. I had done this work so many times across 19 years that my hands knew where to go before my mind decided, which was one of the things I had missed about field work, that particular quality of the body knowing its job. The pile ignited cleanly. By 9 in the morning it was burning with a steady internal heat, and I pulled my folding chair back to the correct observation distance and poured a second cup of coffee and watched. Dex settled at my feet with his chin on my boot, and the morning was quiet except for the fire's low sound and the occasional branch popping inside the pile as the heat reached it. A pair of ravens worked the ridgeline above us, calling back and forth in that flat, authoritative way they have, and a Clark's nutcracker moved through the spruce trees at the edge of the opening, ignoring us. I monitored through the afternoon. By 4, the pile had burned down to roughly half its original height, and by 6, when the light started failing and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees from its midday reading, I certified the burn for the day, noted the wind conditions in my monitoring log, and drove back down the 7 miles in the dark. I did this again on day 2. The pile was lower, the coals deep and reliable, and the morning was clear and very cold, maybe 8 degrees when I arrived. Dex trotted out ahead of me when I opened the truck door, moving across the snow with more energy than he had shown in weeks, which I attributed to the cold air and the novelty of the location. I let him range while I walked the perimeter. If you have ever worked on a burn site, you know what the perimeter looks like after a night of settling. The coals shrink and the edges of the pile sag inward, and there is sometimes a skin of ash blown by overnight wind across the snow in a particular fan pattern that tells you what direction the air came from. I knew exactly what this pile's perimeter should look like because I had walked it the day before and certified it. So when I found 3 of my flagging stakes pulled from the ground and placed in a careful row at the edge of the ash fan, parallel to each other, spaced about 2 feet apart, I stopped walking and I looked at those stakes for a long time. My first explanation was that something had knocked them over and the morning wind had shifted them. I looked at the snow around them. There were no clear tracks, but the snow surface was disturbed in a way that the wind alone did not account for. A compressed area, an indentation, as if something had crouched or stood at the perimeter edge. I walked back to where the stakes had been seated and looked at the holes. They had not been knocked sideways. They had been pulled straight up. I set them back in their holes. I looked at the tree line. Dex was sitting in the snow about 20 feet away, watching me with his head tilted. He was not alarmed. He had the look he got when he had already processed a situation and reached his conclusion and was now waiting for me to catch up. I told myself it was someone from the district checking the burn on an off-hours patrol. That was my second explanation. I told myself someone had pulled the stakes to examine the placement and set them down and driven out before I arrived. The logging road showed no tire tracks other than mine from the day before. The overnight snow would have covered earlier tracks, I noted, and I put the explanation in the column where I file the things I know are incomplete. On day 3, the ravens did not come. I noticed their absence the way you notice the absence of a sound you did not know you were counting on until it stopped. The ridgeline above was quiet. The Clark's Nutcracker was not in the spruce edge. The whole site had a quality of held breath that I initially attributed to the cold, which was dropping towards 0 overnight now, and to the pile itself, which had burned down to a dense hot core about 15 feet across and 2 feet high, no longer putting up the kind of smoke column that announces itself. Then Dex stopped walking beside me and stood at the south edge of the perimeter and pointed his nose at the spruce trees in that careful way he had when he was scenting something he had already decided was not a threat. His tail was down, not raised, but his ears were forward. He was interested, not frightened. There is a difference, and I knew his body well enough to read it. I stood beside him, and I looked at the spruce edge, and I did not see anything. There was a long shadow beneath the lowest branches, dark even in the full mid-morning light, and at the edge of that shadow the snow was compressed in a way I could not account for. Not a track exactly, more like the record of something that had been standing in one place long enough to settle into the snow a few inches. I had 3 inches of boot heel in a thick-soled insulated work boot, and the compressed area in the snow was twice that depth. The width across the compressed zone was, I estimated, slightly wider than the span of my arms. That was my third explanation's failure. I had told myself it was a bear, but a bear would not have pulled 3 flagging stakes and arranged them. A bear would not have compressed snow in a footfall wider than my arm span. A bear would have been gone the moment it scented Dex, and Dex was plainly not distressed. I went back to my chair and poured a cup of coffee, and I sat with the situation the way you sit with a piece of equipment that has given you a reading you cannot make sense of, not dismissing it, not panicking about it, just holding it at a distance while you let your mind work. If you have followed this story to here, you probably already know more than I did at that point. I did not know what to call what I was thinking. I had grown up in the rural West, and I had heard the stories that get told at fire camps and in district break rooms, the stories that the teller always qualifies before telling, always prefaced with, "I am not the kind of person who," and I had always been one of the people who nodded politely and moved on. I was a measurements man. I trusted what I could put a number to. I am telling you this so you understand what it cost me to stop explaining and start watching. On the evening of day 4, as the light went flat and the temperature fell and the pile had burned down to a core that was maybe 8 feet across, and a foot of glowing coals, I found the second piece of evidence. At the north edge of the perimeter, where the snow was deepest against the base of a fallen spruce that had come down in a wind event years before, there was a spruce branch that had been broken fresh and laid across the fallen log, not placed carelessly, placed in a direction that ran parallel to the burn perimeter, like a marker or like a boundary line that something had drawn for its own purposes. The break was clean. The needles were still green. No storm had come through. No wind had been strong enough overnight to snap a branch that size. And even if it had, wind does not lay a branch in a straight line parallel to a human-drawn perimeter. I measured the branch against my arm. I did it twice. It was 4 feet long and as thick as my wrist. I wrote it in my monitoring log. I wrote, "Perimeter supplemented, north edge, 1 spruce branch, fresh break, orientation parallel to flagging line, no proximate explanation." Then I drove back down the 7 miles in the dark, and I sat in my camp chair at the trailhead, and I did not turn on the radio. Day 5 was a Friday. The contract specified 5 monitoring days. By the end of that evening, the pile should have been cold enough to certify final extinguishment, and I would have driven home the next morning with my monitoring log and my field notes and a small check that would cover about 2 months of the basics. That was the plan. I arrived at the site at 7:30 in the morning, and the pile was down to a dense circle of coals, maybe 6 feet across. The snow around it melted in a clean ring and then refrozen overnight into a white crust that crackled when I stepped on it. Dex walked directly to his usual place at the south edge of the perimeter and sat down, looking at the spruce trees, not sniffing, not ranging, just sitting and looking, like he had an appointment. I walked the perimeter. Everything was in order. The flagging stakes were undisturbed. The north edge branch was where I had left it. The snow outside the melt ring showed nothing I could identify, but the quality of the silence was the same as the day before, that held breath quality, the kind of quiet that has something in it rather than nothing. The coals burned down through the day. By 3 in the afternoon, the pile was at a stage I would have called dormant, but not extinguished. A few cubic feet of packed ash with heat still coming up through it, a thin curl of smoke visible when the air moved. I was working through my log when Dex raised his head from my boot and looked directly at the spruce edge, and his tail moved once, a single slow sweep across the snow. That was when I looked up. At the edge of the trees in the gap between 2 large spruce trunks where the shadows were thickest, something was standing. It took me a moment to understand the scale of what I was seeing, the way your eyes require time to recalibrate when what is in front of them does not fit the category they were using. The shape was dark, very dark, and tall enough that the lowest spruce branch that would have been above my own head cleared its shoulder. It was not moving. It was standing the way a person stands when they have been standing in one place for a long time and have stopped needing to shift their weight. I did not move. I am not sure I breathed. The shape was facing the burn pile, not facing me. Facing the pile the way you face a fire when you are tending it, when you have claimed responsibility for it. Its head, which was large and slightly forward set on a neck thicker than both my arms together, was angled down toward the coals. I have sat with a lot of fires. I know what it looks like when a person is monitoring a burn. There is a particular quality of attention to it, a settled watchfulness, the body at rest, but the eyes active, taking in the smoke and the heat shimmer and the slow work of combustion. What I was looking at had that quality, that specific quality, a watchful, patient, deliberate attendance. It stood there. The coals breathed their slow heat. The light continued to fall. I want to be as precise as I can about what I felt, which means I have to tell you what I did not feel. I did not feel afraid. I have been afraid in the field, real fear, the kind that narrows your vision and drains your hands, and I know what my body does when that happens. My body did none of those things. What I felt was something closer to the sensation I sometimes got at the end of a long day of controlled firework, when everything had gone right and the line was holding and the crew was tired but intact, a kind of rightness, a sense of the situation being properly attended. Dex had not moved. He was still sitting at his place at the south edge, watching the shape across the pile with his ears forward and his tail loose. He was breathing slow and easy. At some point, I realized I had matched my breathing to his, which is something I had not done consciously. The shape watched the coals. I watched the shape. The sun moved behind the western ridge, and the light went from gold to grey, and the temperature, which had been holding at around 18 degrees, began to fall again. The last heat from the coals was visible as a shimmer above the ash, and then the shimmer stopped, and the pile was cold. The shape at the spruce edge did not move until that moment, until the last of the heat had gone and the ash was still and grey and the fire was finally completely done. And then it turned, without any haste, without any alarm, and moved back into the trees with a quietness that I could not account for in something that large, and in 3 steps it was gone, and the spruce edge was just spruce trees again. I stood at the edge of the dead pile for a long time after that. I stood there in the dark and the cold, and I did not take any notes, and I did not move toward my truck. I stood the way you stand at a graveside after everyone else has gone, when there is nothing useful left to do, and you stay anyway, because leaving feels like abandoning something that has not finished being attended. That is what came open in me. That specific feeling, the one I had been carrying for 14 months, the private failure of not having been able to stay on Keller Ridge, of having been pulled back by necessity and protocol while 2 of my crew were still up there, of having driven away from that mountain and never found the right way to go back in my mind. The thing I had not been able to do, which was to keep watch until everything was finished and quiet and cold, had been done. For me, without being asked, by something that had no obligation to care about my specific grief, and had cared anyway. I am not a person who cries easily. I want to be clear about that. I have gone years without it. But I stood at that cold pile in the dark at 6,000 feet, with Dex leaning against my leg, and I cried for the 2 men on Keller Ridge for the first time since I had driven away from that mountain. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the long, quiet release of something held too tight for too long. Dex pressed closer against my leg, closer. I put my hand on his head and he was warm. I wrote my final certification in the monitoring log by flashlight. I noted the extinguishment time as 8:47 in the evening, which was accurate. I noted the weather conditions. Clear, wind calm, temperature approximately 12 degrees and falling, snow surface firm. I did not note anything else. I drove the 7 miles back down the logging road in low gear, because the temperature had glazed the ruts with ice. And I drove carefully, the way you drive when you have been changed by something and want to arrive wherever you are going in one piece. I did not go straight home from the burn site the next morning. I sat at the trailhead gate until daylight, not sleeping, not doing much of anything except watching the sky go from black to deep blue to the grey-pink of early October in the mountains. And then I drove south on the 2-lane and stopped at a diner in the first small town and ordered eggs and toast and coffee. And I sat at the counter and ate slowly. The counter had 3 other men at it, none of whom I knew. The woman who poured my coffee had grey-streaked hair and a wool vest, and she refilled my cup without being asked. I said, "Thank you," and she said, "Of course, honey," and went back to the kitchen. I drove home. I put my gear in the barn. I fed Dex. I showered and changed, and I sat at the kitchen table and I looked at my phone for a while. Then I picked it up and I called Cal. It rang 4 times and I was already composing the words of a voicemail when he answered. "Dad." "Hey," I said, I just wanted to call." There was a pause on his end, not a hostile pause, a careful one. "Okay," he said. "I know it's been a while." "Yeah." I tried to say what I had in mind to say, which was something about the last 3 years and what had been lost in them, and what came out was quieter and less organized than that. What came out was, "I miss talking to you. I don't know how else to say it." Another pause, longer. "I miss it too," he said. We did not resolve everything on that call. We did not resolve most things. We talked for maybe 12 minutes, and most of what we said was careful and preliminary. 2 people feeling for solid footing on uncertain ground. He told me the boy was doing well. I asked his name again because I was not entirely sure I remembered it correctly, and when Cal told me, I wrote it on the notepad by the phone. Denny. I wrote it clearly so I would not forget it again. Before we hung up, I said, "I'd like to try again if you're willing." Cal said, "I can do that." That was enough for then. I turned in Whitaker's monitoring log and my field notes at the district office the following Monday. The woman at the front desk processed them and told me the check would be mailed within 15 days. Whitaker was not in, and I did not ask for him, and I drove back the way I had come, through the stripped aspens and the dark scrub oak, and when I reached my own road I turned in and parked and sat for a moment, with my hands on the wheel. The house felt like mine again. Not dramatically, not in any way I could point to and explain. Just the ordinary way a house feels like yours when you have been away for a few days and return to it, and it is still there. I split wood that afternoon, a full rick, more than I needed for the immediate stretch of autumn, and I stacked it against the south wall of the barn where the roof overhang kept the snow off, and when I was done my back ached and my hands were warm from the work, and I felt correct in the way that physical labor sometimes makes you feel correct, like all the parts of you are accounted for. Several months passed. Winter came on hard, the way it does in the north-central mountain country, and I kept the wood stove fed and the driveway passable, and I called Cal twice, once before Christmas and once in January. Both calls were short. Both were real. In February, I mailed a card to his son because it was the boy's birthday, and Cal had mentioned it. Not a fancy card, a plain card with a bear on it because I could not find a card with a blue tick hound. I wrote "Happy Birthday, Denny," inside and signed it Grandpa Roy, and put a $20 bill in the envelope because I had been the recipient of enough birthday cards from distant relatives to know that a $20 bill is the correct gesture when you are still establishing your presence. In late April, when the snowpack was pulling back up the slopes and the ground on the south-facing hillsides was showing bare dirt. I drove back up the 2-lane and unlocked the chain-link gate and drove the 7 miles of logging road to the burn site. I did not have a reason that I could have given to anyone who asked. The contract was long closed. The site had been certified. There was nothing up there that needed me. Dex was in the passenger seat. He was moving slower these days, the way old dogs do when the cold has been in their joints all winter, but his eyes were clear and his appetite was good. When I opened the truck door at the burn site, he stepped down carefully and walked directly to the south edge of the perimeter, the exact place he had sat every morning of the 5-day contract, and he stood there looking at the spruce edge with his nose working. The burn site was what burn sites become in spring. The ash circle was mostly gone, scattered by wind and snowmelt and the beginning of new growth. There were already a few small plants coming up in the clearing that the slash pile had made, pioneer plants that move into bare mineral soil before anything else, pale green and small and definite. I walked the perimeter. The flagging stakes were gone, removed by whoever handles the post-burn cleanup. The fallen spruce at the north edge still had the mark where the branch had been broken, a clean pale scar on the grey bark. I stood at the center of the old ash circle and looked at the spruce edge, and the spruce edge was just trees. But the quiet was different from the way the quiet had been on any of those 5 working days, and different from the way the quiet usually is in high timber. It was the quiet of a place that has been tended, the quiet of something finished. I have not tried very hard to explain to myself what was standing at the edge of those trees on the evening of day 5. I have turned the fact of it over in my hands the way you turn a stone you found at the bottom of a creek, looking at it from different angles, and it does not become something I have a category for. I have decided that is all right. I spent 19 years working in conditions that exceeded the reasonable parameters of prediction, and I learned that the absence of a category does not mean the absence of a thing. It means the absence of a category. Those are different situations. What I know is that something stood watch over that fire until it was finished. What I know is that I had needed, without being able to articulate the need, for someone to do exactly that, for that specific vigil to be kept, and that it was kept by something I could not have asked and did not ask, and that kept it anyway. Dex had settled into the snow beside my boot, the thin April snow that would be gone by afternoon. I stood there a little longer than I needed to. Then we drove back down the mountain, and the aspens at the lower elevation were just beginning to leaf out, tiny and bright green against the white bark, and the whole hillside had that look. It gets in the first real week of spring, that look of something coming back from a long way away.